So today we have the honor of welcoming Dr. Molly Hunter as our featured speaker this month. Her presentation is titled The Changing Role of Fire in Arizona Ecosystems, and it is intended to help hikers understand the ecology and the impacts of fire in the ecosystems throughout Arizona and what land managers can do to mitigate the impacts of fire to ecosystems and communities. And I know fire is on a lot of people's minds these days as we've watched the California videos and everything else, and been hiking this year and comparing it to last year and how dry it is. So welcome, Molly.
Great, thank you. I realized that I did not actually put the title of my talk up there, so I'm glad you mentioned it. Just something I forgot. Anyway, I wanted to start by just telling you a little bit about myself. I've been working in the field of wildland fire and fuels management and science for over 20 years now. Most of that has been at universities, Northern Arizona University and University of Arizona, but I switched over to the federal service about a year and a half ago, and I work for a program called the Joint Fire Science Program, which I'll tell you a little bit about. And my role is to provide scientific advice for them. So not doing so much, have a lot of experience teaching and doing research, but now I'm sort of on the other side of advising a program on what kind of research is needed. So when I was telling Bruce, most of that work means I sit behind a computer now, but every once in a while I still do get to get out and play. So there's me on a prescribed fire a few weeks ago in Tallahassee, and then I also maintain a qualification as a public information officer, so they're the people that go out and talk to the media and do community meetings and things like that during wildfires. So that's me on the Bighorn fire. Okay, so like I said, I'm within the Bureau of Land Management, but I work for a program called the Joint Fire Science Program. Very, very small program, but we're a partnership between the Department of Interior and the U.S. Forest Service. So, all the agencies that work in wildland fire. And our mission is to provide funding for research that relates to all aspects of wildland fire, from firefighter safety to smoke to fuels management to ecology. Anything that fire touches, we've supported some research on. And we care very much about funding science that's going to get used in decision making. So oftentimes you can have this disconnect between, science is funded and what the needs of the end user are. This is kind of a silly cartoon illustrating that, where someone's just asking for the time and a scientist is giving a very, very complicated answer about not being able to give an answer. So our mission is to make sure that our science is being utilized to inform firefighters, to make sure that they're safe in their work, make sure that the work they're doing is effective. And what we know in that regard is that in order for science to be used and useful, often you need almost a translator. Someone who can understand science speak and understand what a practitioner or what a manager really needs. And someone can kind of translate that science information to the needs of managers. And someone who can also understand what the managers need and tell that to the scientists, say, these are the questions that you really need to be addressing. This is what firefighters need. So in order to do that, we fund not only scientific studies, but we also fund a whole network of what we call boundary spanners. So those are the translators, the people that kind of really work at the intersection between scientists and practitioners or managers, or the public, people who can kind of speak both languages, have a foot in both worlds, and can help us understand, what is the science that we should be funding, but also once the science is done, how can we make sure that its managers understand how they can use it. So we do that by funding this network of translators and boundary spanners. We call it the Fire Science Exchange Network. It's wall to wall across the country, and they all work within certain regions because the needs of fire managers, say working, a rancher working in the Great Plains, utilizing prescribed fire, his or her needs are very different than, say, a firefighter working in Ponderosa Pine in the Southwest. So we have kind of people throughout the country in different regions, and are well connected to both the scientists and the firefighters, practitioners in those regions, so that they can, let us know what science is needed, and then they can also translate that science back to the ground. And I'll give you just a couple examples of sort of what this looks like. So we, for example, have funded a lot of research on watershed impacts after fires. So, the fire itself is not only a threat, but afterwards, when all the vegetation has been burned and the soil is not stable, there can be really serious impacts for watersheds. And I'm sure you all have seen this kind of thing before. This is a photo from after the, I think it was the High Meadow Fire in Colorado, early 2000s. Extreme watershed impacts, and they ended up having, just massive amounts of sediment enter into the municipal water supply for Denver, and then Denver Water ended up having to spend millions of dollars to clean that up. So big problems, right? And we have funded some science that says, where are the biggest risks of this kind of thing happening after fire? What are some things that you can do to kind of mitigate that after the fire? And what are some things you can do even beforehand to make sure this doesn't happen in the first place? And some areas where this kind of science has been applied is in the Santa Fe watershed. So they recognize that this is a threat to their critical water supply. And through a fee that is on their water bill for the users of the water in that watershed, they funded a lot of work to do thinning and prescribed fire to reduce the threat of a severe fire that would have severe impacts to the watershed. Our boundary organization then organized a field trip to that site that included people throughout the Southwest, including people from Flagstaff, and those people then took this idea back to Flagstaff and said, why can't we do something similar? We have similar threats, similar issues. And so they then initiated a municipal bond that passed in the city of Flagstaff and was again to fund lots of thinning, forest thinning, and prescribed fire to protect critical watersheds. So an example of how this comes full circle. We fund the science, our boundary organization is out there making sure people are aware of it, and that has real world impacts on the ground. Another example, you mentioned Jack Cohen. We funded a lot of his work that had to do with, what are effective things that people can do around their homes and around their communities to make sure that they're more resilient to wildfire. If a fire is impacting, is coming close to the community, what are some things that will increase the likelihood that the structures will survive? So we funded a lot of work in that area. And then we have our Southwest boundary organizations that does things like host these Arizona WUI, Wildland Urban Interface Summits, where they invite, HOAs, community groups, all kinds of folks, local fire departments to talk about the science of how you can really protect communities from fire, and what it takes to kind of implement things like FireWise and other programs. And we had one person I talked to that ended up going to one of these summits was Sally Crum. She's the FireWise coordinator up in Summerhaven, and just saying that how it really, this summit that occurred, the first one occurred several years ago, but really spearheaded a lot of efforts in Summerhaven to reduce the threat of fire to a lot of the structures in the community. So again, we're funding the science, we're making sure it gets out there, and then it's having real world impacts. Some of you have probably seen this photo before. This was, when the Bighorn Fire was coming up into Summerhaven. It was taken from the fire station there, and a lot of the efforts that the community went through prior to that fire was really instrumental in making sure that it survived that fire. Okay, so that's just a little bit about the program that I work for now. Now, kind of getting into what I came to talk about, you know, what's the ecology of sort of fire and different ecosystems in Arizona, and how is that changing? I know I used this last time I was here. I'm sure I did, because I use it in just about every talk I give. And I do that because it's, I think, important to understand that, you know, there is both good fire and bad fire from an ecological perspective. I think we all know kind of what bad fire looks like, right? When a fire is really impacting people, burning up structures, burning up homes, people having to evacuate, lots of smoke, influencing public health. Those are all examples of fire that's bad, right? And ecologically, when fire gets really hot in some ecosystems, it can also be bad, right? It can be difficult for forests and other ecosystems to recover if fire is too hot in some instances. So those are kind of some examples of, you know, what we as fire ecologists would consider kind of bad fire. But fire has also been in our ecosystems for many millennia, and it's a really critical part of our ecosystems. It has the effect of reducing biomass that otherwise would just accumulate over time and result in really, really hot fire. It recycles nutrients. A lot of plants have evolved with fire and need it for reproduction. And it's been utilized since time immemorial by Native Americans. And the more we learn about kind of how Native Americans have used fire, it seems like it was pretty ubiquitous across North America. And they used it for, you know, basketry, hunting, I mean, all kinds of things, or spiritual practices. But fire was a critical tool that they used to manage ecosystems. And so a lot of ecosystems have evolved with fire. And it would be, you know, nice if I can get up here and say that this is a dichotomy, right? But it really isn't. It's more of a continuum. And it can be kind of tricky to understand sometimes when a fire is burning. Is this a good fire? Is this a bad fire? I'd even wish I could say it was as simple as, you know, a prescribed fire is good and a wildfire is not, but it's not quite that simple. Sometimes wildfire has good effects. I wish I could also say perhaps, you know, when fire is low intensity, it's good, and when it's really, really hot, it's bad, but even that's not necessarily true. Some ecosystems have evolved with very, very intense fire. So a lot of what we do as fire ecologists is try to decipher when a fire is occurring. Is it good? Is it bad? And how do we do that? One thing we do is we look to history. How has fire burned in an ecosystem in the past? And we do that by characterizing what we call a fire regime. You know, so we try to look at history to understand how often did fire occur in this area. When it did occur, how hot was it? What season did it occur in? How big was it? How diverse was it? How big were the patches of high intensity? And we do that by, you know, we can do things like look at the tree ring record. This shows several tree rings in a cross section of a tree, and you can see all those scars there indicate when a fire hit that tree. So you can date the tree rings and look at when the fires occurred, and that gives you some indication of how often fire occurred in that area. Same thing with soil cores and in meadows and lake bottoms. You can kind of date the charcoal layers to understand how often fire occurred. And then you can look at historical photos and historical accounts to try to understand what fire was like in the past as well. And then we also look to ecology. So we'll look at the different plants that are growing in an area, and we try to decipher whether or not they have adaptations to fire. So if a plant species has evolved with fire for, thousands of years, it's going to have really specific adaptations that allow it to either survive if a fire comes through an area, or to, come back if it dies after a fire. So some examples of this include trees with really, really thick bark, like this ponderosa pine here. This area here is where the tree is growing, right? That's where it's putting on new rings every year. And so if you, damage this whole layer, the tree's going to die. But this really, really thick bark insulates that layer, so the tree can survive even if a fire passes through it. Also, the buds at the bottom of the base of these needles, that's where a tree is putting on new needles every year. Those really, really long pine needles act to kind of protect that bud. So even if a fire passes through it, that bud's going to be insulated and the tree's going to be able to still produce new needles after the fire's passed. So if I'm walking through an area and I see those species or those kinds of adaptations, I will say, oh, this is a fire-adapted ecosystem. You can also look for things like, here's an oak that obviously was top killed. You can see the black stump there, so pretty hot fire went through there, killed the top of the tree, but it's resprouting from its roots underground. So it's got buds underground that were insulated in the soil and survived fire, and then the plant resprouted. So when I see something like this, I say, oh, this ecosystem has evolved with fire, and it's probably evolved with pretty hot fire. And if a really, really hot fire moved through there, it's not necessarily bad ecologically. Okay, so, y'all are hikers, probably been all over Arizona. You know that we have a really, really wide diversity of ecosystems. And all of them have evolved with fire in different ways. And so that continuum from hot to, not hot fire to no fire to infrequent fire, you can find those kinds of regimes in all different ecosystems in Arizona. So if we stop kind of at the highest elevation or towards the highest elevation in mixed conifer forests, we know that these systems evolved with fairly hot fire. There's lots of fuel there, a lot of biomass, lots of material to burn, but historically these areas would have had snow on the ground for much of the year or pretty wet conditions, and so that wouldn't be conducive for fire starting and spreading very often. Really only under drought conditions would you have seen fire. And you can see kind of evidence of this in the past. So this is the inner basin up in Flagstaff in the peaks there. You can see all this aspen there. Aspen is a species that resprouts after fire, after usually pretty hot fire. So anytime you see that is an indication of, probably 100 or so years ago, there was a pretty big fire in that area. And it comes back, the system recovers, and so it's an indication that kind of event, that kind of hot fire isn't necessarily out of character for this particular ecosystem. And again, we can decipher that by looking at historical photos, looking at the ecology in the system that has a lot of resprouting species, and that gives us an indication that, this system evolved with fairly intense fire. So, one of the things I think Bruce asked me to talk about is sort of what do you look for when you're hiking around in these systems? What should you look for to understand if it's kind of out of whack or not? These systems, I want to say, they have been impacted by fire suppression or the elimination of fire because, historically fires might have occurred every 20, 30 years, and, with elimination of fire over a century, then the system sometimes has missed a few fires, and that can cause a buildup of fuel and more intense fires. So usually what you want to look for if you are in an area where one of these systems has been impacted by fire, what you would want to see is not necessarily, no mortality or no areas of really severe fire, but you would want it to be kind of patchy. This might be difficult to see, but you can kind of see here, this is an aerial view of a mixed conifer forest that have burned, and you can see there's still a lot of living trees, but there's little patches where it got kind of hot. That's perfectly normal, and something that you would even want to see in a system like this. In those hot areas that got hot, you might expect, aspen or something like that to come back. That being said, if these kinds of systems are butting up against communities, or if they occur in, critical municipal watersheds, then in those areas, obviously, you wouldn't necessarily want to see really hot fire because it could threaten some of those values. So it's not uncommon to see a little bit more aggressive thinning or prescribed fire in areas where you want to protect communities, or you want to protect a watershed, and you don't really want that hot fire. Now, so going down in elevation, ponderosa pine forests are a little bit drier, still fairly productive. They've got those long needles, thick bark, and if you look at fire history, historical photos, plus all that ecology, that tells us that fire was very, very common, very frequent in these forests. Historically, it would have occurred on the order of every 3 to 10 years. And that had the effect of keeping the biomass, the fuels down. And typically what you would have seen is a fire that kind of looks like this photo in the lower corner. Really low intensity, just kind of burning through the needles, not killing the trees other than maybe, the really small seedlings or saplings. So this was very common historically. And this is, arguably the system where we've seen probably the most change. When fire was historically really, really frequent, every 3, every 5, every 10 years, over 100 years, if you miss fire, then a lot of biomass has a chance to kind of come back in that time frame. So what's happened is you've had this historical photo here of what ponderosa pine typically look like. So pretty open, easy to walk through. Branches are high above the ground, and just grasses and litter in the understory. And that would have been maintained by frequent fire. What's happened in the absence of fire is a lot of growth of shrubs, and also ponderosa pine seedlings and other tree species seedlings that have had a chance to grow and survive, because otherwise they would have been killed normally by fire. And with all of that accumulated biomass, what happens now is when a fire burns through those systems, it has a greater potential to be really intense. And ponderosa pine is not evolved, it's not really adapted to that kind of really, really intense fire. So what you end up with is, an area after where there's been a lot of tree mortality, bare soil, and that sets up a condition for, really dangerous watershed effects, lots of erosion and flooding. But also it's just really challenging for that to come back as a ponderosa pine forest on its own. Ponderosa pine seed doesn't travel very far, and so it's really hard for it to come back on its own in some of those really big, high severity patches. So what would kind of a natural ponderosa pine forest look like, or a healthy one? There's some examples here. These are from the Gila National Forest and Grand Canyon, areas that have been restored and are now kind of maintained with frequent fire. And you see these forests are, fairly open. They don't have all those young trees in the understory. Really diverse understory of grasses and forbs. And when fire does break through it, it tends to be really, really low intensity. The branches are high off the ground, and so that means if a fire burns in the understory, it's not going to climb up the branches into the tops of the trees, which can often happen. And so this is a fire that's pretty easy for firefighters to corral and control. fairly safe to do prescribed fire. And so this is kind of what it ideally would look like. And then I'll talk a little bit about deserts and what we know about our Sonoran deserts and really all Western deserts is that historically there was very little history of fire. So, deserts of course are frequently hot and dry, so it's not necessarily the climate that is limiting fire, but it's the fuel. There just isn't typically a lot of biomass that would normally carry fire. It's not to say that it would never happen. Sometimes, you get a wet winter or a wet summer and a lot of grass or a lot of forbs sprout up, and sometimes there's enough to carry fire. So I wouldn't say that fire was non-existent in these systems, but it was pretty rare. And we know this again mostly by looking at kind of historical records, but also a lot of the species in this system don't have very good adaptations to fire. Whenever you see, all the cacti and the saguaro and the palo verde, when they have that green bark, they're growing out of that green bark. So anytime a green part of a plant is impacted by fire, it's easily killed. And the things that are changing in this system are a lot of non-native species, mostly grasses, but not exclusively grasses. Down here, you probably hear a lot about buffalo grass, maybe fountain grass. Those are kind of problematic species here. But there's others. There's red brome, Mediterranean grass, stinknet. All of these have the same effect of just increasing the amount of biomass that's in the system. They, once it's not raining, after a month or so of no rain, they dry up. They become this brown color, and they're pretty flammable. It's pretty easy for fire to spread through that kind of fuel. And you can kind of see a small saguaro cactus growing out of the center of this bunch of buffalo grass here. If fire were to spread through that cactus wouldn't survive. It's not to say that some of these species, when they're old enough, they can withstand some fire if it's not too hot, but ordinarily there's not really great adaptations to fire in this system. But in all of these systems, we have, this is really across the country, you're seeing these same trends of wildfire. And I know this is difficult to read, but these graphs are showing things like the amount of acres burned over time, the amount that we spend on fire suppression, the insurance losses over time, but they're all, any measure of fire, it's trending up, or has been trending up over the last, several decades. And there's three really main causes of that. One is climate. So with increasing drought, with warmer temperatures, mainly that means that the fire season is much longer than it has been historically. So, I'd say 30 years ago it would have been unheard of to have a fire in January or December, but now it's becoming pretty commonplace. There's no snow on the ground. If it's dry enough, windy enough, you can get a fire spreading any time of year. Another is fuel. Just so, and by fuel, it's a fire speak term, but it's just biomass, anything that will burn in a fire, whether it be grass, litter, wood, living plants. All of that has accumulated over time in the absence of fire, and that's been due to suppression of fire, also the removal of indigenous people from their lands who historically burned a lot. All of that has had the effect of increasing the amount of fuel in a lot of these landscapes. And just like in a campfire, the more wood, the more fuel you add to it, the hotter it gets. And so the same thing kind of happens across all our ecosystems. And then the third factor is people. Of course, we have more structure ignition, more impacts to communities because people are, living more in fire-prone areas. But also with people, you get more ignitions. If you're building a community, you need a power line to that community. If people are out in the woods, they're going to be, lighting campfires, fireworks, maybe using equipment that sparks or driving down a road with chains that sparks. All of that just leads to more ignitions. More people means more ignitions. And indeed, most of our, really impactful negative wildfires now are caused by people. But I don't want to leave you on that kind of now negative, sour note. There are a lot of efforts to combat this at multiple levels. And one thing that's been, I think, really encouraging in the last several decades is this agreement around this strategy, the National Cohesive Wildland Fire Strategy. And this is something that everything from a municipal firefighter up to, the director of the Forest Service knows about and adheres to, and understands that all of these circles at this strategy are really critical for combating this wildfire crisis. So that means creating fire-adapted communities, resilient landscapes, and ensuring for safe, effective, and risk-based wildfire response. And I could talk about each of those in a minute, but one thing I want to point out too is that through all iterations of this strategy, everyone agrees that science is in the center. Science has to really be informing all of those strategies to make sure that we're doing them in a way that's going to be effective, efficient, and the best, utilizing the best course of action. So resilient landscapes, what does that mean? Well, that just means that any kind of ecosystem is more resilient to fire, more resilient to insect outbreaks and other pest outbreaks and invasive species, in accordance with how we want those lands managed. So that can include managing fuels by things like forest thinning, prescribed fire, control of invasive species, reintroducing cultural burning is a growing practice as well. And also even utilizing wildfire when we can to meet some of those objectives. Because again, not all wildfire is bad. Some of it causes really good ecological effects, and it does some of the work for us when sometimes getting out and doing prescribed fire can be really challenging. Also, fire-adapted communities is a really, really critical piece of this puzzle. So making sure that, again, communities are going to be able to withstand wildfire and survive from them. We cannot eliminate wildfire. We try as hard as we can to put them out when they are small, but we're not always going to be successful at that. So communities have to be prepared if a wildfire is to impact them or come close to them. So that includes kind of preparing your home, with taking into consideration the building materials, what you're planting around the home, but also as a community, making sure there's solid evacuation plans, making sure that the roads are designed so that fire trucks can get in and out. All of those things and more go into building communities that are more resilient to wildfire. And the third is this notion of safe, effective, and risk-based wildfire response. And again, it's the agency's mission to put out fires as small, when they're small, when they can, but that's not always going to be possible. And once a fire gets beyond a certain size, you can't really just put it out by throwing water on it. It requires kind of a long-term management response. And the kind of response that I'm sure you all experienced when the bighorn fire burned in your backyard, right? It was months of several fire teams kind of coming in and managing the fire. And those long duration events, it is a strain on the system. It's a strain on the firefighters who are working 16-hour days, 14 days at a time, and there might be multiple fires going on in the country at the same time, and there aren't always resources available to handle all of them. So that means kind of being really strategic about where you're putting firefighters and what you're asking them to do. And oftentimes, as is the case in the bighorn, the priority was protecting structures. So they had lots of crews up in Summerhaven, down in the foothills when the fire was threatening those areas, and then in Oracle. But the rest, they really backed off, looked at natural features on the landscape that were really safe areas to kind of stop the fire, where they felt comfortable putting firefighters in, and where they felt like they could be effective. So for example, they, one of the things they did was utilize old fuel breaks that were built in the Aspen fire to stop the bighorn. So rather than, taking bulldozers and putting in new line, utilizing existing line, we feel like we can safely put firefighters here and stopping it at strategic points. Those are all examples of, using safe, effective, and risk-based wildfire response. And the outcome is another example where the outcome ecologically was not really all that bad. So this is the fire severity map. Have you guys seen these before? So basically all it means is the red areas are the areas of this fire where it burned pretty hot, probably hotter than we would have wanted. But all the green and yellow are areas that it burned with pretty low intensity and probably did a lot of ecological good, probably reduced fuels quite a bit and reduced the risk to communities going forward. So this fire ended up doing really a lot of work for us. It had a much bigger footprint than what, say, the Coronado was able to do with prescribed fire. Okay, yeah, so I think I have some time for questions if you all have any.
I've heard that some insurance companies may be declining to insure houses here in SaddleBrooke. Has anyone here heard about that at all?
So yeah, the question is about insurance companies and maybe declining people in SaddleBrooke. This was a big topic at the latest Arizona WUI Summit, just occurred a couple months ago here in Tucson. I had not heard that yet for SaddleBrooke. I have heard it for other areas in and around Tucson. Some people are already getting cancellation notices. In fact, I live in central Tucson and my insurance company decided to leave town. I think not because I'm in a wildfire threatened area, but insurance companies are under a lot of strain right now. It's just becoming very, very expensive to insure people. They're risk averse, and what's happening in Los Angeles and other areas, it does affect everyone, right? So I have not heard that yet for SaddleBrooke. I don't know if anyone else has, but it is something that's happening around the country a lot more commonly.
I did read something about the state that designated this as a higher risk because of the urban wildlife interface here. But I don't know if that's true.
I don't know, so I'd have to zero in on kind of some of the risk maps. And then of course, the insurance companies have their own ways of assessing risk that we don't necessarily know about because it's all proprietary, tools and models that they're using. So it's not even clear how much they're using some of the, public risk maps that are out there.
You had the words cultural burning. What's that?
So that's a term that a lot of indigenous people use, and sometimes, and wouldn't say all tribes, but a lot of them prefer the term because they see their way of burning as very different than, say, what the Forest Service or other public agencies do, because they're burning for certain materials. Sometimes it's a very spiritual practice, and so there's a big movement, especially in places like California, to allow indigenous people to do a little bit more of that, even on public lands, recognizing that the way they burn is very different than, say, the way agencies burn.
So, are you on the chopping block?
I'm currently employed.
Yeah, because one of the things I read recently was, people that, you said that you just changed your position. So supposedly if you change your position,
then you're on probation for 2 years and you're a probationary employee, so you could go.
So my probationary period was 1 year, so I, over that period, yeah, but certainly, and you know, if whatever you've read in the newspapers is about as much as I know, in terms of the numbers of people that have been let go of different agencies.
What's the sign showing with building, say, home construction to make it more fireproof? What kind of developments?
Yeah, and you know, I'd say this is an area where there's still in need of a lot more science, because a lot of the science around home construction, it's designed for fires that start from the inside of the home and go out. And so fires starting from outside and coming in is a pretty different phenomenon. But some of the things people have found are, you know, having vents or screens on vents is really important, because often it's usually embers that fall on a roof, fall in a gutter where there's litter, fall on a screen or something like that. An ember falling on something that's flammable and catching fire. So removing litter and vegetation and wood piles and whatnot right around your home, having some kind of fire-resistant roofing material, cleaning your gutters, and having some kind of screen on vents. Those are all things that are really important. You know, building materials, often that's something that you can really only think about when you're building a new home. You know, so, and that does happen. You know, when the campfire, which burned down Paradise, it's a tragic event, but it also creates an opportunity to kind of rebuild differently. And often that is what happens. It's what happened in Summerhaven. They kind of changed the building codes after that event. You know, the houses there are a lot more fire resistant than they were before the Aspen fire. Same thing is happening in Paradise. So, you know, when the opportunity to rebuild presents itself, it does kind of spur an innovation in building to make it more fire resistant. But even in the absence of what you're building, but there's lots of things you can do, just, you know, with vegetation and cleaning things up around your home to make it more fire resistant.
Can you expand on that a little more, say, for a community of 85,000 homes that are sitting out in the desert on SaddleBrooke? You know, what should we be doing?
Well, you know what a great thing to do would be to call I sort of Golder Ranch is probably your local fire department. You know, most fire departments will come out and do an assessment of your property for free.
I'm talking about the whole community. What should we be doing community-wise?
Yeah, what people do community-wise is things that have been really successful are, you know, having organized days where you kind of clean up, say, buffalo grass or whatever, you know, whatever problem fuel is in your community spaces, you know, in the rights of way or, you know, other things like that. Those are things that can easily be done as a community. You know, if it's Summerhaven, this wouldn't necessarily applicable here, but they have kind of chipping days where people can bring all their material and get it chipped. But those kinds of community efforts, think like where in our neighborhood are there kind of some problem biomass and fuels, and what can we do collectively to mitigate some of that? Other than that, I'd say it's education. Again, having the fire department come and look at your home and encourage other people to do the same. And the more people that are kind of practicing some of these risk mitigation measures, the safer the whole community is going to be overall.